The men who built America carried secrets to their graves. Picture yourself standing in the quiet of a museum after hours, the glass cases around you holding artifacts from another age, the air heavy with the weight of centuries. In one case, a set of dentures gleams dully in the low light, metal and ivory, and something else. Something that the small printed card does not quite explain. These belonged to George Washington, the father of his country, and their story is far stranger and darker than any school book ever told you. This is the beginning of a journey into the hidden lives of the Founding Fathers, a journey that will reveal them not as marble statues, but as complicated, flawed, and deeply human figures whose secrets have been waiting in the shadows for someone to find them. Feel the weight of history around you as we prepare to look behind the mythology that has grown up around these men over 2.5 centuries. The story of America's founding is often told as a tale of noble visionaries, men of unimpeachable virtue who created a nation based on ideals of liberty and equality. That story is true as far as it goes. But it is not the whole truth, and the parts that are missing tell us something important about who these men really were, about the compromises they made, the contradictions they lived with, and the human weaknesses they struggled against, even as they shaped a new nation. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed, for this story will wait patiently for your return. The night is quiet now, the kind of quiet that settles over old places when the crowds have gone and only the past remains. Imagine the soft glow of candlelight falling across parchment pages, the scratch of a quill pen recording secrets that would not be revealed for generations. The men who signed the Declaration of Independence, who drafted the Constitution, who fought and argued and compromised their way to creating the United States, were not the demigods that later generations would make them. They were men of their time, products of a world that operated by rules quite different from our own, and their private lives were often as complicated and troubling as any lives today. Let yourself drift back to that spring day in May of 1784, when a transaction was recorded in the account books at Mount Vernon, George Washington's Virginia plantation. The entry is brief, almost businesslike in its simplicity, but its implications have echoed down through the centuries to trouble our understanding of the man we call the father of our country. The ledger notes a payment to unnamed enslaved people for 9 teeth, purchased on behalf of a French dentist who had been treating Washington for his chronic dental problems. 122 shillings changed hands that day, and those 9 teeth began a journey that would eventually lead them, perhaps, into George Washington's own mouth. Slowly the scene shifts to consider the man himself, this Virginia planter who would become a general and then a president, whose face appears on our currency and whose name adorns our capital city. George Washington was not the granite figure of popular imagination. He was a man who suffered greatly, who struggled with physical ailments that would have broken lesser spirits, and whose relationship with the institution of slavery was far more complicated than the simple stories suggest. His teeth, or rather the lack of them, caused him pain and embarrassment throughout his adult life, shaping his public image in ways that few people today understand. Close your eyes and see the young Washington, not yet 30 years old, sitting in a chair while a doctor named Watson extracts one of his teeth. It is 1756, and this is the first documented tooth extraction in Washington's life, though it would be far from the last. He paid 5 shillings for this service, a significant sum at the time, and recorded the expense in his diary with the same careful attention he gave to all his financial affairs. This was the beginning of a long decline, a slow loss that would continue for decades until, by the time he stood to take the oath of office as the first president, only a single tooth remained in his mouth. In the gentle flow of time, consider what this meant for a man of Washington's position and ambition. In the 18th century, teeth were not merely tools for eating, but symbols of health, vitality, and moral character. Their loss was associated with gluttony, poor hygiene, and even venereal disease, afflictions that respectable people preferred not to discuss in polite company. For Washington, who cared deeply about his public image and understood the importance of appearing strong and capable, the deterioration of his teeth was a source of constant anxiety. He spent enormous sums on dental care, tried every remedy available, and suffered through procedures that would make modern patients shudder. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The myth of Washington's wooden teeth has persisted for more than 2 centuries, passed down through generations of school children who learned it as established fact. It is a comforting myth in its way, suggesting a certain folksy authenticity, a willingness to make do with humble materials that fits the image of the self-made American. But the truth is both more interesting and more disturbing. Washington's dentures were never made of wood. They were crafted from a variety of materials that speak to both the ingenuity and the moral blindness of his age. Hippopotamus ivory, brass, gold, lead, the teeth of horses and cows, and human teeth, whose origins raise questions we may never fully answer. Picture yourself examining one of Washington's surviving dentures, now preserved in a museum where curious visitors can see for themselves what the history books got wrong. The base is carved from hippopotamus ivory, chosen for its density and durability, though it had an unfortunate tendency to stain and crack over time. Metal components hold the structure together, springs and wires that must have made wearing the device an uncomfortable experience at best. And set into this framework are teeth, some clearly from animals, but others that are unmistakably human in their form and origin. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away as we consider where those human teeth might have come from. The historical record provides one documented answer that has become increasingly difficult to ignore. In Washington's ledger books, maintained with the meticulous care that characterized all his business dealings, there is an entry for May 1784 recording a payment to enslaved people at Mount Vernon for 9 teeth. The transaction was made on behalf of Jean-Pierre Lemeilleur, a French dentist who had been corresponding with Washington about dental treatments, and who was known to advertise for people willing to sell their teeth. Meanwhile, somewhere in the distance, a clock chimes the hour, marking the passage of time that separates us from that long-ago transaction. The practice of purchasing teeth from the poor was not unusual in the 18th century. Those who had nothing else to sell could sell parts of their own bodies, and dentists who needed human teeth for dentures and transplant procedures were willing buyers. But the transaction recorded in Washington's books raises questions that have no comfortable answers. Could the enslaved people at Mount Vernon truly consent to selling their teeth when they had no legal right to refuse any demand made by their owner? Feel the weight of history around you as we consider the implications of this discovery. For generations, Americans were taught to see Washington as a benevolent slaveholder, a man who treated those he enslaved with relative kindness and who freed them in his will. The reality was more complicated. Washington bought and sold human beings throughout his life, separated families when it suited his business interests, and used various means to prevent those he enslaved from escaping to freedom. The teeth transaction, whatever its exact circumstances, reminds us that the relationship between enslaver and enslaved touched every aspect of life, including the most intimate and bodily.
Let yourself drift back to imagine the moment itself, though we must acknowledge that we are imagining. For the historical record tells us nothing of how this transaction actually occurred. Did a dentist or overseer approach the enslaved community asking for volunteers? Were specific individuals selected and given no real choice in the matter? Did anyone resist, and if so, what were the consequences? The silence of the historical record on these questions is itself significant, a reminder that the perspectives of enslaved people were rarely considered worth recording by those who held power over them. And you can let this moment blur softly as the night deepens around us. The price paid for those 9 teeth was roughly 13 shillings each, a fraction of what free white people in the cities received for the same commodity. This disparity tells its own story about the value placed on different bodies in 18th century America, about the economic calculations that shaped every interaction between the enslaved and their enslavers. Even in selling pieces of themselves, the people at Mount Vernon received less than their counterparts elsewhere, their bodies valued lower simply because of the color of their skin and the legal status that color conferred. Slowly, the scene shifts to consider what Washington himself thought about these arrangements, though here again the historical record offers more silence than answers. Washington was a man of his time, raised in a society that considered slavery a natural and necessary institution, and he seems to have accepted its premises without much questioning for most of his life. Yet there are hints that he grew more troubled by the institution as he aged, particularly after the Revolution forced him to confront the contradiction between fighting for liberty while holding others in bondage. In the gentle flow of time, consider the physical reality of Washington's dental situation during his presidency. When he delivered his inaugural address in 1789, he did so with only one natural tooth remaining in his mouth, a lower left bicuspid that his dentist John Greenwood would eventually extract and preserve in a golden locket as a memento. The dentures Washington wore were heavy, uncomfortable, and changed the shape of his face, giving him the tight-lipped expression visible in many of his portraits. Gilbert Stuart, who painted the most famous image of Washington, noted that the president had recently received new dentures that made his lower face appear unnaturally stiff. Picture yourself watching Washington at a formal dinner during his presidency, observing the careful way he ate and spoke, the constant awareness of the device in his mouth that threatened to slip or click at any moment. He avoided certain foods, declined to give long speeches, and struggled to project the image of effortless authority that he knew the new nation needed from its leader. The physical discomfort was constant, and the social anxiety it produced shaped Washington's public persona in ways that few of his contemporaries understood. The reserved, dignified manner that later generations would interpret as aristocratic bearing was partly a strategy for managing a dental situation that caused him daily embarrassment. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The care Washington took to hide his dental problems from the public extended to treating all correspondence about them as confidential. During the Revolutionary War, when he needed dental supplies sent to him in the field, he insisted that the package be disguised and the contents kept secret. When British forces intercepted a packet of his mail that included a letter to his dentist, Washington was mortified to learn that his enemies now knew about his physical weakness. The letter had revealed that he could not come to Philadelphia soon, information that the British correctly interpreted as indicating his true location and intentions.
Breathe deeply and let the years fade away.
John Greenwood, the dentist who served Washington during his final years, became something of a specialist in managing the president's dental needs. He crafted multiple sets of dentures, each slightly different, each an attempt to improve on the last. Greenwood's letters to Washington reveal a relationship of surprising intimacy, the doctor scolding the president for not cleaning his dentures properly, for drinking too much port wine that stained the ivory, for failing to return devices that needed adjustment. The great man, it seems, was not always a model patient.
Feel the weight of history around you as we consider what the story of Washington's teeth tells us about the founding era more broadly. The fact that a president of the United States may have worn the teeth of enslaved people in his mouth is not merely a historical curiosity, but a symbol of something profound about the nation's origins. America was built on contradictions, on the simultaneous embrace of liberty and the practice of slavery, on ideals of equality that coexisted with brutal hierarchies of race and class. Washington's dentures, with their mixture of metal and ivory and human teeth of uncertain origin, embody these contradictions in physical form.
The night grows deeper now, and the museum where we began our journey has fallen into complete darkness. The display case with Washington's dentures catches no light, reveals nothing to any observer who might pass. But the story it contains continues to speak across the centuries, reminding us that the past is never as simple as we would like it to be. That the heroes we celebrate were also human beings, capable of participating in systems of cruelty that we now recognize as evil. This is not a comfortable truth, but it is a necessary one if we are to understand who we are as a nation and where we came from. Imagine the sounds of Mount Vernon in that spring of 1784, the bird song and the rustle of wind through newly leafed trees, the voices of enslaved people going about their daily work, the distant clatter of horses on the road. Somewhere on the plantation, a transaction is taking place that will not be fully understood for more than 2 centuries. Teeth passing from one person's mouth to a ledger book, to a dentist's office, to perhaps the mouth of the most powerful man in America. The people who surrendered those teeth had names that were not recorded, lives that were not considered worthy of documentation, and their story has been waiting all this time for someone to tell it. And as the hour grows late and the shadows lengthen across the sleeping plantation, we leave George Washington to his struggles and his secrets. The father of our country was neither saint nor monster, but something far more complicated. A man who helped create a nation founded on liberty while holding hundreds of people in bondage, who fought for independence while depending on the labor of those who had none. His teeth, those troublesome teeth that caused him so much pain and embarrassment, have become an unexpected window into this complexity, a reminder that even the most familiar stories contain depths we have barely begun to explore. There will be nothing to solve right now, only a quiet passing of time. But Washington was not the only founding father with secrets hidden in his cellar, his ledger books, his most private correspondence. As we continue our journey through the hidden lives of these legendary figures, we will discover that almost all of them carried burdens that history has been slow to acknowledge, compromises and contradictions that complicate the simple stories we learned as children. Let yourself drift back one final time to consider the broader context of dental care in 18th century America, a world so different from our own that it can be difficult to fully comprehend.
There were no dental schools, no standardized training, no licensing requirements for those who claimed the ability to treat teeth. Barbers, blacksmiths, and traveling charlatans all offered dental services, and the treatments available were primitive by any modern standard. Extraction was the most common procedure, performed without anesthesia, often with tools that would look more at home in a carpenter's workshop than a medical office. The wealthy could afford better care than the poor, of course, as in all things. Washington's dentists were among the most skilled practitioners of their day, men who had studied the latest techniques and imported the finest materials from Europe. But even their best efforts could not reverse the damage that had already been done, could not restore what time and disease, and perhaps the treatments themselves, had taken. The mercury-based medications that Washington received for various ailments throughout his life may have contributed to his tooth loss, a tragic irony that his doctors could not have understood. In the gentle flow of time, consider the psychological burden that Washington carried along with his physical discomfort. He was acutely aware that his appearance mattered, that the new nation he was helping to create needed symbols of strength and stability. His tall figure and commanding presence had served him well during the Revolution, inspiring confidence in troops who needed to believe their general was capable of leading them to victory. But his dental problems threatened to undermine that image, to reveal weakness where strength was needed, decay where vitality was expected. Picture yourself in the audience during Washington's inaugural address, watching the new president speak with obvious difficulty, his words slightly muffled by the device in his mouth, his face frozen in an expression that might be mistaken for sternness, but was actually an effort to keep his dentures in place. Those who were close enough to see might have noticed the slight movements of his jaw, the careful way he formed each word, the relief that crossed his features when the speech was finally complete. This was the hidden cost of leadership, the private struggle behind the public triumph. The moon rises over the sleeping plantation, casting silver light across the fields where generations of enslaved people labored. And in the archives, in the memories passed down through families whose stories were never recorded, the truth waits patiently for those willing to seek it. Picture yourself walking one last time through the grounds of Mount Vernon, past the outbuildings where blacksmiths and carpenters worked, past the kitchen garden where herbs grew for the great house's table, past the quarters where more than 300 enslaved people lived and worked and raised their children under the watchful eye of the man they called Master. This was Washington's world, an empire built on the labor of people who would never share in its rewards. And understanding this world is essential to understanding the man who ruled it. In the gentle flow of time, consider the complex relationship between Washington and the institution that made his wealth and power possible. He was not born to great fortune, but married into it, gaining control of significant enslaved labor through his wife Martha's inheritance. Over the decades that followed, he proved himself an efficient and demanding manager of this human property, keeping careful records of births and deaths, of productivity and punishment, of every aspect of the system that sustained his lifestyle. The teeth transaction was just one small entry in a lifetime of such calculations. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The question of whether Washington's views on slavery evolved over his lifetime is one that historians have debated for generations. There is some evidence that he became increasingly uncomfortable with the institution as he aged, particularly after the Revolution exposed the contradiction between American ideals and American practice. He expressed private doubts about slavery's morality, avoided discussing it in public,
and included provisions in his will for the eventual emancipation of the people he had enslaved. But he also took elaborate steps to prevent his slaves from gaining their freedom while he lived, including rotating them out of Philadelphia before they could meet residency requirements that would have made them legally free.
Feel the weight of history around you as the night settles into its deepest quiet. The story of Washington's teeth is ultimately not about dentistry, but about the intimate connections between power and the body, between the great men who shape history and the ordinary people whose labor and sacrifice make that history possible. When Washington gave his inaugural address with teeth that may have come from enslaved mouths, he embodied in the most literal way the dependence of American liberty on American slavery. Slowly, the scene shifts toward morning, though dawn is still hours away. The artifacts in the museum case, the ledger entries in the archive, the oral histories passed down through generations. All these fragments of evidence have finally been assembled into a picture that complicates without diminishing the man we call the father of our country. Washington remains a figure of genuine greatness, a leader who held a fragile nation together through war and peace, who set precedents that have endured for more than 2 centuries. But he was also a man of his time, capable of benefiting from systems of oppression that we now recognize as evil. Let yourself drift back to imagine Washington in his final years, plagued by the dental problems that had tormented him throughout his life, perhaps aware that history would eventually discover the secrets he had tried to keep hidden. What did he think about the transactions recorded in his ledger books, the teeth purchased from people who had no real power to refuse? Did he ever consider the faces of those who had surrendered pieces of themselves for a few shillings each? The historical record offers no answers, only the silence of a man who preferred to keep his private thoughts private. And you can let this moment blur softly as we prepare to continue our journey. The story of Washington's teeth is a reminder that even the most familiar figures from history contain depths we have barely begun to explore. Every fact we think we know can be complicated by new evidence, new perspectives, new questions that previous generations failed to ask. This is not a reason for despair, but for curiosity, an invitation to look more closely at the past and to find in its complications not confusion, but richness, not disillusionment, but deeper understanding. Perhaps tomorrow will bring different revelations, different secrets, a different understanding of the men who made America and the price that others paid for their greatness. The Georgian townhouse at 36 Craven Street in London looks much as it did 2.5 centuries ago. Picture yourself walking through the narrow streets of the city as evening falls, the gas lamps not yet lit, the cobblestones still warm from the afternoon sun. This was Benjamin Franklin's home for nearly 2 decades before the Revolution, a comfortable residence in a respectable neighborhood where the American diplomat could entertain visitors, conduct his scientific experiments, and plot the course of colonial resistance to British rule. The house still stands today, preserved as a museum, and visitors who tour its elegant rooms rarely think to wonder what lies beneath their feet. But in 1998, workers renovating the basement made a discovery that would cast a strange new light on Franklin's years in London. Feel the weight of history around you as we descend into that basement, following the path of the construction workers who first uncovered what had been hidden there for more than 2 centuries. They were excavating the old garden area, preparing to strengthen the foundation, when one of them struck something unexpected with his shovel. A bone, clearly old, clearly human. Then another, and another. By the time the digging was complete,
More than 1,200 bone fragments had been recovered from a pit beneath what had once been Franklin's back garden. The remains of at least 15 people, including several children. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The discovery made headlines around the world, as discoveries involving famous historical figures tend to do. Had Benjamin Franklin, beloved founding father and face of the $100 bill, been secretly murdering people and burying them in his basement? The tabloid newspapers certainly suggested as much, and for a few breathless weeks the possibility seemed almost plausible. Franklin had always been a man of secrets, after all, a man who understood that appearances could be deceiving, and that the most respectable facades sometimes concealed the darkest realities. Could the genial inventor and philosopher have hidden a monstrous secret beneath his London home? Picture yourself as one of the construction workers who first stumbled upon those bones. The shock of recognition as the shape of a human skull emerged from the dirt. The growing horror as more bones appeared with each shovelful of earth removed. The workers stopped their digging immediately and called the police, who arrived expecting to investigate a crime scene. The house had changed hands many times over the centuries, and there was no reason to assume that the bones were connected to Franklin at all. But when forensic analysis revealed that the remains dated to the mid-18th century, the period when Franklin had lived there, the implications became impossible to ignore. In the gentle flow of time, consider the peculiar position that anatomists occupied in 18th century society. They were simultaneously respected and reviled, admired for their contributions to medical knowledge, and condemned for the methods they used to acquire that knowledge. The dissection of human bodies was considered necessary for the advancement of medicine, but it was also considered a violation of the sacred dignity of the dead. Most people wanted the benefits of anatomical research without having to think too carefully about where the bodies came from. Slowly, the scene shifts to consider what the investigators actually found when they examined those bones more carefully. The forensic analysis revealed marks on many of the bones, cuts and scratches that could only have been made by surgical instruments. Skulls showed evidence of trepanning, the drilling of small holes that was once thought to relieve pressure on the brain. Limbs had been sawed through at the joints, vertebrae had been separated, and ribs had been cut away to expose the organs beneath. These were not the remains of murder victims, but of something almost equally disturbing to modern sensibilities: the raw materials of an anatomy school. Bodies that had been dissected in the pursuit of medical knowledge. Feel the weight of history around you as we consider the underground world that supplied anatomy schools with their necessary materials. The resurrection men, as they were sometimes called, operated in the shadows of respectable society, emerging only at night to ply their gruesome trade. They developed sophisticated techniques for exhuming bodies quickly and quietly, leaving minimal evidence of their work. They knew which graveyards were easiest to access, which watchmen could be bribed, which families were too poor to afford the iron cages and armed guards that wealthy families used to protect their dead. And you can let this moment blur softly as the night deepens around Franklin's old home. The demand for bodies far outstripped the legal supply, creating a market that the resurrection men were eager to fill. A fresh corpse in good condition could command a substantial price, more than many workers earned in a month of honest labor. The anatomists who purchased these bodies asked no questions about their origin, preferring not to know the details of how they had been obtained. This willful ignorance allowed the whole system to function, maintaining a thin veneer of respectability over practices that most people found abhorrent. Let yourself drift back to understand what this means. we must consider the state of medical education in 18th century London. The study of human anatomy was revolutionizing medicine, allowing doctors to understand for the first time how the body actually worked. But it faced a serious obstacle. British law severely restricted the supply of corpses available for dissection, limiting legal sources to the bodies of executed murderers. This was nowhere near enough to meet the demand from medical schools and ambitious young doctors eager to learn the secrets of the human form. In the gentle flow of time, consider the solution that enterprising anatomists found to this problem. If legal bodies were scarce, illegal ones would have to suffice. A shadowy industry emerged, populated by men who called themselves resurrection men, but whom others knew simply as grave robbers. These specialists would visit fresh burial sites under cover of darkness, dig up the newly interred, and deliver the corpses to anatomy schools for a price. The practice was ghoulish, but technically legal, since under English law, a dead body could not be stolen, only the clothes or jewelry buried with it. Close your eyes and see the narrow lanes of London at night, a cart rattling over cobblestones with its grim cargo concealed beneath a tarpaulin, making its way to one of the many anatomy schools that operated throughout the city. The smell would have been terrible, the risk considerable, but the profits made the trade worthwhile. A fresh corpse could fetch several guineas, enough to keep a resurrection man comfortable for weeks. And the anatomy schools, desperate for material, asked few questions about where their specimens came from. And you can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. William Hewson was one of the most promising young anatomists in London during the years when Benjamin Franklin lived at Craven Street. He had studied under William Hunter, one of the foremost medical educators of the age, and had made significant contributions to the understanding of the lymphatic system and the process of blood coagulation. In 1770, Hewson married Polly Stephenson, the daughter of Franklin's landlady Margaret Stephenson, and the following year he moved into the house at Craven Street to be closer to his new family. It was there, in the basement and back garden of Franklin's residence, that Hewson established his own anatomy school. Picture yourself descending the stairs to Hewson's dissecting room, the air thick with the smell of preserving chemicals and something worse beneath it. Tables would have been arranged to catch the light from high windows, and on those tables would have lain the subjects of the day's lessons, their bodies opened to reveal the mysteries within. Students would have gathered around, watching as Hewson demonstrated the techniques of dissection, learning to see the human body not as a sacred vessel, but as a mechanism to be understood and, eventually, repaired. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away. Franklin himself was almost certainly aware of what was happening in his basement. He was a scientist at heart, endlessly curious about the workings of the natural world, and he would have understood the importance of anatomical research to the advancement of medicine. His friendship with Hewson was close and warm. He wrote letters praising the young man's intelligence and industry, and he tried to mediate a dispute between Hewson and his former mentor, William Hunter. The idea that Franklin was ignorant of the dissections taking place under his own roof strains credibility. Feel the weight of history around you as we consider what this tells us about Franklin and his era. The bones in the basement were not evidence of murder, but of something more complicated, a willingness to operate outside the law in pursuit of knowledge, to benefit from practices that most people would have found deeply disturbing if they had known about them. Franklin, the champion of liberty and the common man, was hosting an operation that depended on the violation of graves and the commerce in human remains. Meanwhile, somewhere in the distance, church bells mark the passing of another hour in that long-ago London. The bodies that ended up on Hewson's dissecting tables came from somewhere. and that somewhere was almost certainly the cemeteries of the city's poor. Wealthy families could afford to protect their dead with iron cages, watchmen, and deep burial vaults. But the poor had no such defenses. Their loved ones were buried in shallow graves in overcrowded churchyards, easy targets for the resurrection men who prowled the city after dark. There will be nothing to solve right now, only a quiet passing of time. Let yourself drift back to imagine one of those resurrection men at work, perhaps in the very churchyard that supplied Houston's school. The night is dark, the moon hidden behind clouds, and the only sound is the scrape of a shovel against earth and the occasional hoot of an owl. The grave is fresh, the dirt still loose, and within an hour the body will be free, loaded onto a cart, and on its way to Craven Street. The family who buried their father or mother or child just days ago will never know what happened, will tend a grave that holds only empty clothes and a coffin full of stones. In the gentle flow of time, consider the ethical calculations that men like Franklin and Houston must have made. They knew that anatomical research saved lives, that every body dissected contributed to knowledge that would eventually benefit thousands of patients. They also knew that the bodies they used had been taken without consent, that families had been deceived and graves violated. Did the ends justify the means? It was a question that 18th-century medical men answered with a resounding yes, though they preferred not to discuss the matter in polite company. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. Houston's career was cut tragically short in 1774 when he accidentally cut himself while dissecting a corpse and died of the resulting infection. He was only 34 years old, already recognized as one of the leading anatomists of his generation, with discoveries still to make and students still to train. Franklin was devastated by the loss, writing to his wife that their family in London was in great distress. He praised Houston as an excellent young man, ingenious, industrious, useful, and beloved by all who knew him. The anatomy school at Craven Street closed with Houston's death, and the bones in the basement were forgotten until construction workers stumbled upon them more than 2 centuries later. Picture yourself in that basement now, not as it was in Houston's day, but as it appeared to the workers who discovered the bones in 1998. The pit where the remains were buried had been covered over long ago, hidden beneath layers of earth and later construction. The bones were jumbled together, some complete and some fragmented, stripped of the flesh that had once covered them by time and the work of the anatomist's knife. They were the remnants of people whose names we will never know, whose lives were considered unimportant enough that their bodies could be stolen and sold, whose final dignity was denied them in the name of progress. Slowly the scene shifts to consider what happened to those bones after their discovery. Forensic anthropologists examined them carefully, documenting the cut marks and determining the minimum number of individuals represented. The police were initially called, as they must be whenever human remains are found, but the investigation was quickly closed once the age of the bones was established. They were eventually reburied in a London cemetery, given at last the peaceful rest that had been denied them when they first died. Feel the weight of history around you as we consider the larger implications of Franklin's involvement in this shadowy world. He was a man of the Enlightenment, committed to reason and progress and the improvement of human welfare. And yet, he benefited from practices that treated the dead as commodities and the poor as sources of raw material. This was not unusual for his time. Many of the era's most brilliant minds had similar connections to the anatomy trade. but it complicates the image of Franklin as a simple champion of liberty and equality. And you can let this moment blur softly as we prepare to leave Craven Street and its secrets behind. The house at 36 Craven Street is now a museum dedicated to Franklin's memory, carefully restored to reflect its appearance during the years he lived there. Visitors can tour the rooms where Franklin worked and entertained, see the chair where he sat, and the desk where he wrote. The basement where Hewson conducted his dissections has been excavated and preserved, and some of the bones discovered there are on display, a reminder of the strange history that unfolded in this elegant Georgian townhouse. Let yourself drift back one final time to consider what Franklin himself would have thought of this disclosure. He was a man who understood the power of reputation, who carefully crafted his public image as a plain-speaking philosopher and friend of the common people. He might have been embarrassed to have his connection to the anatomy trade revealed, or he might have defended it as necessary for the advancement of knowledge. We cannot know, for he left no record of his thoughts on the matter, only the silent testimony of the bones buried beneath his garden. In the gentle flow of time, consider how the story of Franklin's basement reflects the broader contradictions of the Enlightenment era. The same period that gave us declarations of human rights and the abolition of the slave trade in Britain also gave us the anatomy trade, the exploitation of the poor, and the treatment of human bodies as objects to be bought and sold. Progress came at a cost, and that cost was often paid by those who could least afford it. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away. The bones in Franklin's basement are a reminder that even our greatest heroes were products of their time, capable of benefiting from systems that we now recognize as unjust. This does not diminish Franklin's genuine achievements, his contributions to science and politics, and the founding of a new nation. But it does complicate the simple stories we tell about him, adding shadows to a portrait that was once almost entirely light. The night has grown deep now, and the streets of London outside Franklin's former home have fallen quiet. The tourists have returned to their hotels, the museum staff have locked the doors, and the house stands empty once again, keeping its secrets as it has for more than 2 centuries. But the bones beneath the garden have been discovered at last, their story finally told, and they remind us that the past is never quite what we imagine it to be. And as we leave Benjamin Franklin to his complicated legacy, we turn our attention to another founding father whose private life would become the subject of the most sensational scandal in early American history, a scandal that nearly destroyed his career and whose echoes can still be heard today. But before we depart from Craven Street entirely, let yourself drift back to consider one final aspect of this strange story. The bones in Franklin's basement were eventually reburied in a London cemetery, given the dignified rest they had been denied for more than 2 centuries. A memorial service was held, prayers were said, and the unnamed dead were finally laid to rest properly. It was a small gesture of restitution, an acknowledgement that these had once been living people with families and hopes and fears, not merely raw material for scientific advancement. In the gentle flow of time, consider what this means for our understanding of progress itself. The advances in medical knowledge that came from anatomy schools like Hewson's have saved countless lives over the centuries. The surgeons who learned their craft on those dissecting tables went on to heal patients who would otherwise have died. But this progress came at a cost, paid by the poor and powerless, whose bodies were taken without consent, whose families were deceived, whose graves were violated in the name of science. The calculus of benefit and harm is not simple, And the story of Franklin's basement reminds us that even the most beneficial advances can have dark origins. Feel the weight of history around you as you consider the house at Craven Street today, restored and preserved, a museum dedicated to Franklin's memory. Visitors walk through the rooms where he lived and worked, admiring the period furnishings, imagining the conversations that took place within these walls. Most of them do not know about the bones in the basement, about the anatomy school that operated beneath the elegant Georgian facade. But those who do know see the house differently, understanding that even the most respectable exteriors can conceal complicated truths. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The story of Benjamin Franklin and the bones in his basement is ultimately a story about the complexity of history itself, about the way that progress and darkness can coexist in the same place, about the human capacity to pursue noble goals through ignoble means. Franklin was a man of the Enlightenment, committed to reason and progress and the betterment of humanity. But he was also a man of his time, willing to tolerate practices that we now find shocking, complicit in systems that treated some human beings as less than fully human. This does not make him a villain, but it does complicate the simple stories we tell about heroes. Picture yourself walking away from Craven Street as the first light of dawn begins to color the London sky. The city is waking up around you, the sounds of modern traffic replacing the clatter of horse-drawn carriages, the smell of coffee replacing the coal smoke that once filled the air. But beneath your feet, the past remains. Layers of history built one upon another, secrets waiting to be discovered by anyone curious enough to dig beneath the surface. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away. The bones have been reburied, the museum has been opened, the story has been told. But the questions that the bones raise have not been answered, not fully, not finally. How do we weigh the benefits of progress against its costs? How do we honor the dead while celebrating those who advanced knowledge through their bodies? How do we remember the powerless who were exploited by the powerful, even when that exploitation led to genuine good? These questions have no easy answers, but they are questions worth asking. Questions that the bones in Franklin's basement have been waiting more than 2 centuries to pose. The night has grown late, and the streets of London have fallen quiet. The house at 36 Craven Street stands dark and silent, keeping its secrets as it has for more than 250 years. But the bones beneath the garden have been discovered at last, their story finally told. And they remind us that the past is never quite what we imagine it to be, that even our greatest heroes were capable of participating in systems we now recognize as wrong, and that this knowledge, uncomfortable as it may be, is essential to understanding who we really are and where we really came from. Perhaps tomorrow will bring new discoveries, new secrets, new complications to the stories we thought we knew. The summer of 1791 was hot in Philadelphia, the streets dusty and the air thick with humidity. Picture yourself walking through the city that served as America's temporary capital, past the brick townhouses and busy markets, the government buildings where the new nation's leaders were struggling to create a functioning republic from the raw material of revolution. In one of those buildings, Alexander Hamilton was working late, as he always did, surrounded by ledgers and reports, his mind consumed with the endless complexities of establishing a national financial system. He was 34 years old, married with children, at the height of his power and influence, and he was about to make a mistake that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Feel the weight of history around you as we consider the man who stood at the center of this story. Alexander Hamilton was not like the other founding fathers. He had not been born to wealth and position in Virginia or Massachusetts, but had clawed his way up from desperate poverty in the Caribbean, an illegitimate child whose mother died when he was young and whose father abandoned him even earlier. His brilliance was undeniable, his ambition limitless, and his capacity for work legendary. George Washington considered him indispensable, and his vision for American economic development would shape the nation for generations to come. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. But Hamilton had weaknesses too, and the greatest of them was about to walk through his door. Maria Reynolds was 23 years old, beautiful and apparently desperate, and she had a story calculated to appeal to Hamilton's vanity and his sense of himself as a protector of those in distress. Her husband had abandoned her, she said, left her without money or resources in a city where she had no friends. She had heard that Hamilton was a generous man, and she threw herself upon his mercy. Would he help her? Would he give her the money she needed to return to her family in New York? Slowly, the scene shifts to Hamilton's townhouse later that evening, where he arrived with the money he had promised. Maria met him at the door and led him upstairs to her bedroom. And what happened next would provide material for America's first major political sex scandal. In Hamilton's own words, written years later when he was forced to confess, it quickly became apparent that other than pecuniary consolation would be acceptable. The affair had begun, and it would continue, with varying intensity, for more than a year. Let yourself drift back to understand the world in which this affair took place. A world that was in some ways more permissive, and in other ways far more dangerous than our own. Extramarital affairs were not uncommon among the wealthy and powerful of the 18th century, and they were often conducted with a certain discretion that allowed all parties to maintain their public reputations. But they were also potential weapons in the brutal political battles of the era, ammunition that could destroy a career if deployed at the right moment by the right enemies. In the gentle flow of time, consider the peculiar arrangement that developed between Hamilton and the Reynolds family. Maria's husband James was not as absent as she had claimed. In fact, he returned to Philadelphia shortly after the affair began and quickly recognized the opportunity that his wife's liaison presented. Rather than challenging Hamilton to a duel, as honor would have demanded of a wronged husband, James Reynolds chose a more practical course. He began to extort money from his wife's lover, demanding payment in exchange for his silence. And you can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. Hamilton paid. Over the course of the following year, he handed over more than $1,000 to James Reynolds, a substantial sum that represented roughly a third of his annual salary as Treasury Secretary. The payments were made in cash, delivered to Reynolds at various locations around Philadelphia, and they continued even after Hamilton tried to end the affair. Every time he thought he was free, another letter would arrive, another demand for money, another threat to expose everything if he did not comply. In the gentle flow of time, consider the psychological torment that Hamilton must have experienced during this period. He was one of the most powerful men in America, architect of the nation's financial system, trusted confidant of President Washington, and yet he was at the mercy of a small-time con man and his wife. The letters from James Reynolds alternated between demands for money and expressions of friendship, as if the extortion were merely a business arrangement between equals. The letters from Maria veered between passionate declarations of love and desperate pleas for continued contact. Hamilton was trapped in a web of his own making, unable to extract himself without destroying everything he had built. Picture yourself reading one of Maria Reynolds' letters to Hamilton, her handwriting looping across the page, her spelling uncertain, her appeals designed to manipulate the emotions of a man who had already proven susceptible to her charms. She wrote of her distress when he stayed away, of her husband's cruelty, of her desperate need to see him again. Whether these feelings were genuine or manufactured to keep the extortion scheme running smoothly is impossible to say. Maria Reynolds remains one of the most enigmatic figures in the early American story, a woman whose true motivations have been debated for more than 2 centuries. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The question of Maria Reynolds' agency in this affair has fascinated historians for generations. Was she a victim of her husband's schemes, forced to seduce Hamilton against her will? Was she a willing participant, sharing in the profits of extortion? Was she genuinely attracted to Hamilton, caught up in an affair that spiraled beyond her control? The historical record provides evidence that can be read in various ways, and different interpreters have reached different conclusions. What seems certain is that she was trapped in an abusive marriage to a man who was willing to prostitute his wife for profit, and that whatever choices she made were constrained by circumstances that left her few good options. Feel the weight of history around you as we consider the peculiar dynamic that developed between Hamilton and the Reynolds couple. James Reynolds encouraged his wife to continue the affair even after he knew about it, recognizing that Hamilton's attachment to Maria was a renewable source of income. He wrote letters to Hamilton that mixed threats with friendly advice, suggesting that the 2 men were partners in some strange enterprise that benefited them both. The psychological manipulation involved was sophisticated, designed to keep Hamilton off balance, unable to simply walk away, always hoping that one more payment would finally end the nightmare. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away. The affair finally ended in the summer of 1792, but its consequences were far from over. James Reynolds had been involved in a scheme to defraud the government by claiming the back pay owed to deceased Revolutionary War veterans, and when he was arrested that November, he began dropping hints that he had damaging information about the Secretary of the Treasury. 3 congressmen, including future President James Monroe, visited Reynolds in jail and heard his insinuations about financial impropriety involving Hamilton. Feel the weight of history around you as we consider what happened next. The congressman confronted Hamilton at his home, expecting to uncover evidence of corruption that would destroy their political enemy. Instead, Hamilton made a confession that left them stunned. He was not guilty of financial misconduct, he explained, but of something far more personal. He had been having an affair with Maria Reynolds, and the payments her husband received were not bribes, but blackmail. To prove his story, Hamilton showed them the letters he had received from both Maria and James, intimate correspondence that laid bare the whole sordid arrangement. There will be nothing to solve right now, only a quiet passing of time. The congressman agreed to keep Hamilton's secret, recognizing that his personal failings were not a matter of public concern so long as his official conduct remained beyond reproach. But James Monroe, perhaps already contemplating the political advantages that might come from possessing such damaging information, made copies of the documents Hamilton had shown them and sent them to Thomas Jefferson, Hamilton's greatest political rival. The secret was no longer truly secret. It was merely waiting for the right moment to explode into public view. Let yourself drift back to consider the 5 years that passed between this confrontation and the eventual revelation of the affair. Hamilton continued his public career, fighting political battles, shaping economic policy, and making enemies who would welcome any opportunity to destroy him. The documents Monroe had copied circulated among a small circle of political insiders, a ticking bomb that could be detonated whenever it suited someone's purposes. Hamilton must have known that the threat was always there, that any day could bring the exposure that would shatter his reputation and his family. In the gentle flow of time, consider the moment when that bomb finally exploded. In 1797, a journalist named James Callender published a series of pamphlets accusing Hamilton of financial corruption during his time as Treasury Secretary. Callender had obtained the documents that Monroe had copied, and he presented them as evidence that Hamilton had been involved in illegal speculation. The accusation was false, but Hamilton faced a terrible choice. He could remain silent and let people believe he had betrayed his public trust, or he could tell the truth and reveal that he had betrayed only his wife. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. Hamilton chose to confess. In a document that became known as the Reynolds pamphlet, he laid out the entire story of his affair with Maria Reynolds, the extortion scheme, and the payments he had made to her husband. He published the letters Maria and James had written to him, exposing his own weakness and humiliation in excruciating detail. His defense was essentially that he was guilty of adultery, but not of corruption, that he had betrayed his marriage vows, but not his oath of office. It was a remarkable document, unprecedented in American political history, and it destroyed any chance Hamilton might have had of becoming president. Picture yourself reading the Reynolds pamphlet when it first appeared, the pages dense with Hamilton's self-justification and the damning evidence of his folly. Public reaction was mixed. Some admired his candor, his willingness to expose his private shame in order to clear his public name. Others were appalled by the details he had revealed, the letters from his mistress begging him to visit, the careful accounting of blackmail payments made. His wife Elizabeth was devastated, forced to see her husband's infidelity laid out for all the world to read. Slowly, the scene shifts to consider the aftermath of this extraordinary confession. Hamilton's political career did not end immediately, but his path to the presidency was effectively blocked. He remained influential in Federalist circles, continued to practice law, and involved himself in political controversies that would eventually lead to his fatal duel with Aaron Burr. But the Reynolds affair followed him, a permanent stain on his reputation that his enemies never tired of mentioning. The man who had built America's financial system, who had envisioned a powerful commercial republic, would be remembered as much for his personal failures as for his public achievements. Feel the weight of history around you as we consider what the Hamilton affair tells us about the Founding Fathers and their era. These were not marble saints, but flesh and blood men, capable of the same weaknesses and follies as any other human beings. Hamilton's brilliance did not protect him from making a catastrophic error of judgment, and his ambition may have contributed to the recklessness that led him into Maria Reynolds's arms. The same qualities that made him a great statesman also made him vulnerable to manipulation by a woman and her scheming husband. And you can let this moment blur softly as the night grows deeper around us. Elizabeth Hamilton, for her part, eventually forgave her husband, or at least chose to remain with him despite his betrayal. After his death in the Burr duel, she devoted the remaining 50 years of her life to preserving his legacy, collecting his papers, and defending his reputation against those who sought to diminish it. She never spoke publicly about the Reynolds affair, maintaining a dignified silence on a subject that must have caused her immense pain.
Her loyalty to Hamilton's memory became itself a kind of monument, a testament to a love that survived even the deepest betrayal.
Let yourself drift back one final time to consider the strange fate of Maria Reynolds after the scandal that bears her name. She divorced James Reynolds with the help of an unlikely attorney, Aaron Burr, who would later kill Hamilton in their famous duel. She remarried, moved to England for a time, and eventually returned to Philadelphia, where she lived quietly under a different name. The woman who had been at the center of America's first sex scandal spent her later years in obscurity, her story told and retold without her input, her motivations forever a matter of speculation. In the gentle flow of time, consider how the Reynolds affair has been remembered and reinterpreted over the centuries. In recent years, it has gained new prominence through Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical Hamilton, which turns the story into a modern meditation on ambition, temptation, and the price of secrets. The song, "Say No to This," captures Hamilton's moment of weakness, while the Reynolds pamphlet dramatizes the aftermath of his confession. A scandal that once threatened to be forgotten has been given new life, reaching audiences who might never have encountered it otherwise. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away. The story of Hamilton and Maria Reynolds is a reminder that the Founding Fathers were human beings first, and historical figures second. That they struggled with the same temptations and made the same mistakes that people still make today. Hamilton's affair did not diminish his contributions to American government, but it did reveal the limitations of even the most brilliant minds when confronted with their own desires. The night has grown late now, and Philadelphia sleeps beneath a blanket of stars that have witnessed 2 centuries of change since Hamilton walked these streets. The city he helped to shape has grown and transformed, but human nature remains the same, still capable of greatness and folly in equal measure. Picture yourself standing outside the house where Hamilton lived during his time as Treasury Secretary, imagining the complicated emotional life that unfolded within those walls. His wife Elizabeth, known as Eliza, was devoted to him completely, had borne his children and managed his household and supported his ambitions through years of political struggle. She knew nothing of Maria Reynolds, nothing of the letters that arrived at odd hours, nothing of the money that disappeared without explanation. When the truth finally emerged, she was forced to process her husband's betrayal in the most public way imaginable, with every detail printed in newspapers and pamphlets for all the world to read. In the gentle flow of time, consider what the aftermath of the Reynolds pamphlet meant for the Hamilton family. Alexander and Eliza would go on to have more children after the scandal, suggesting that some form of reconciliation took place. But the wound never fully healed, and the memory of Maria Reynolds would shadow their marriage for the rest of Hamilton's life. When he died in the Burr duel in 1804, just 7 years after the pamphlet's publication, Eliza was left to pick up the pieces, to raise their children alone, and to defend her husband's legacy against those who would remember him only for his failures. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. Eliza Hamilton lived for 50 years after her husband's death, dying at the remarkable age of 97 in 1854. During those decades, she worked tirelessly to preserve Alexander's papers, to tell his story as she believed it should be told, to ensure that future generations would understand his contributions to the nation he helped to found. She never wrote a memoir, never gave interviews about her personal life, never publicly discussed the Reynolds affair or her feelings about it.
Her silence was itself a kind of statement, a determination to control the narrative, even as others sought to exploit her pain for their own purposes. Feel the weight of history around you as we consider the strange afterlife of the Hamilton-Reynolds scandal. For most of the 2 centuries after Hamilton's death, the affair was treated as a minor footnote to his larger story, an embarrassing episode that biographers acknowledged but did not dwell upon. It was only in recent decades, and especially after the success of Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical, that the story regained its central place in the Hamilton narrative. The Reynolds pamphlet, once a dusty artifact of 18th century political warfare, has become one of the most famous documents in American history. Slowly, the scene shifts to consider the broader implications of Hamilton's confession for American political culture. The Reynolds pamphlet established a pattern that would be repeated countless times over the following centuries. A public figure caught in private misconduct, choosing between concealment and confession, weighing the costs of each approach, ultimately deciding that honesty, however painful, was preferable to continued deception. Hamilton's calculation was that his reputation for financial integrity was more important than his reputation for marital fidelity, and he was probably right. But the confession itself became part of his story, inseparable from his achievements, a reminder that even the most brilliant minds can make catastrophic personal choices. There will be nothing to solve right now, only a quiet passing of time. Let yourself drift back to imagine Maria Reynolds in the years after the scandal. This woman whose name became synonymous with temptation and betrayal. She divorced James Reynolds with Aaron Burr's help, married his accomplice Jacob Clingman, moved to England for a time, and eventually returned to Philadelphia, where she lived quietly under a different name. She joined the Methodist Church, became religious, and seemed to make peace with her past. She died in 1828, outliving both Hamilton and Burr, her story told and retold by others who had their own reasons for portraying her as villain or victim. In the gentle flow of time, consider what Maria Reynolds' own perspective might have been if she had ever been given the chance to tell her story in her own words. Was she a willing participant in a scheme to extort money from a powerful man? Was she a victim of her husband's manipulation, used as bait and then discarded? Was she genuinely attracted to Hamilton, caught up in an affair that spiraled beyond her control? The historical record provides no definitive answers, only fragments and hints that can be interpreted in various ways. Maria Reynolds remains an enigma, her true self hidden behind the roles that others have assigned her. And you can let this moment blur softly as the night gives way to the first hints of approaching dawn. The story of Hamilton and Maria Reynolds is a reminder that the Founding Fathers were not the marble statues that later generations would make of them. They were flesh and blood, capable of passion and folly, capable of making choices that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Hamilton's affair did not make him a bad person or a bad statesman, but it did reveal the limitations of even the most exceptional individuals when confronted with their own desires. The same ambition that drove him to reshape American finance also drove him into a relationship that nearly destroyed everything he had built. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away. Philadelphia in the dawn light looks much as it must have looked to Hamilton in those anxious days after his confession. The familiar streets now charged with new meaning, every face a potential judge, every whisper a possible condemnation. He survived the scandal, continued his work, remained influential in political circles. But something had changed. Some part of his armor had been stripped away,
and he would never again enjoy the unquestioned respect that had once been his due. And as we leave Hamilton to his complicated legacy, we turn our attention to another founding father whose personal life would become the subject of even more enduring controversy. A controversy that would not be resolved until DNA evidence finally provided answers that historians had debated for generations.
The hills of Virginia roll gently toward the horizon, green with summer growth, quiet in the evening light. Picture yourself standing on the terrace at Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's beloved mountaintop home, looking out over the landscape he cultivated for more than 60 years. The house behind you is a monument to Enlightenment ideals, filled with books and scientific instruments, designed by a man who believed in reason, progress, and the perfectibility of human society. But within these elegant walls, and in the quarters that housed the people Jefferson enslaved, a secret was kept that would not be fully acknowledged for more than 200 years. Feel the weight of history around you as we consider the man who built this place and the woman whose presence here would become the subject of the longest-running controversy in American historical scholarship. Thomas Jefferson wrote the words that defined America's founding ideals, declaring that all men are created equal and endowed with certain unalienable rights. He served as governor, ambassador, secretary of state, and president. And for nearly 4 decades he maintained a relationship with an enslaved woman named Sally Hemings that would produce at least 6 children and would trouble the nation's conscience long after both were dead. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. Sally Hemings came to Monticello as an infant, part of the inheritance that Jefferson's wife, Martha, received from her father, John Wales. The connection between the families was closer than that simple statement suggests. John Wales had taken an enslaved woman named Elizabeth Hemings as his concubine after the death of his wife, and Sally was their daughter. This made Sally Hemings the half-sister of Jefferson's wife, a relationship that must have been known to everyone at Monticello, even if it was never openly acknowledged. When Martha Jefferson died in 1782, she made her husband promise never to remarry, and he kept that promise for the remaining 44 years of his life. Slowly, the scene shifts to Paris in 1787, where Jefferson was serving as American minister to France. His younger daughter Maria was coming to join him, and she needed an attendant for the voyage across the Atlantic. Sally Hemings, then about 14 years old, was chosen for this task. When she arrived in Paris, she entered a world utterly different from the Virginia plantation where she had been raised, a world where slavery did not exist, and where she could, if she chose, claim her freedom under French law. Let yourself drift back to imagine Sally Hemings' experience in Paris. This young woman suddenly freed from the legal bonds that had constrained her entire life. She was exposed to a culture that did not recognize the institution that defined her existence in America, that would have protected her right to remain in France as a free woman if she had chosen to assert it. According to her son, Madison Hemings, who gave an account of the family history in 1873, it was in Paris that the relationship between Sally and Thomas Jefferson began. In the gentle flow of time, consider the enormous imbalance of power that characterized this relationship from its very beginning. Sally Hemings was perhaps 14 or 15 years old when the relationship started. Jefferson was in his mid-40s, a widower, one of the most powerful Americans of his generation. Even in Paris, where Sally was technically free, Jefferson controlled her access to money, to housing, to the possibility of remaining in France or returning to America. The question of consent in such circumstances is complicated at best and impossible at worst. And you can let this moment blur softly
and the story will carry on.
Madison-Hemings's account, given to a newspaper editor in Ohio decades later, offers the only direct testimony we have about the negotiations that took place in Paris. According to Madison, his mother was reluctant to return to America and the slavery that awaited her there. Jefferson convinced her to come back by promising that her children would be freed when they reached adulthood. This promise, if it was made, was largely kept. Sally Hemings's children were either allowed to leave Monticello or formally freed in Jefferson's will, a distinction granted to no other enslaved family at the plantation. Picture yourself at Monticello in the years after Jefferson's return from France, watching the household rhythms that concealed this extraordinary secret. Sally Hemings worked as a chambermaid and seamstress, attending to Jefferson's personal quarters and belongings. She bore children at regular intervals, children who were described by visitors as bearing a striking resemblance to the master of the house. Jefferson's grandchildren would later claim that these children were fathered by one of Jefferson's nephews, but this explanation has been conclusively disproven by DNA evidence gathered in 1998. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away. The story of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings first became public in 1802, when a journalist named James Callender published accusations in a Richmond newspaper. Callender was a former ally of Jefferson who had turned against him when the president refused to give him a political appointment, and his motives were clearly vindictive. But his basic claim that Jefferson had maintained a long-term relationship with an enslaved woman and had fathered children with her has been confirmed by both historical evidence and modern science. Feel the weight of history around you as we consider Jefferson's response to these accusations, which was essentially no response at all. He never publicly addressed Callender's charges, following his general policy of not responding to personal attacks in the press. His silence has been interpreted in various ways over the centuries. Some have seen it as dignified refusal to engage with scurrilous journalism. Others have read it as tacit acknowledgement that the charges were true. The truth of Jefferson's feelings on the matter died with him, leaving only speculation in its wake. There will be nothing to solve right now, only a quiet passing of time. Let yourself drift back to consider the lives of Sally Hemings' children, born into slavery, but aware of their extraordinary parentage. Beverly and Harriet, the two eldest who survived to adulthood, were light-skinned enough to pass as white, and both left Monticello in their early 20s, disappearing into white society and leaving no trace that historians have been able to follow. Madison and Eston, the two youngest sons, were freed by Jefferson's will and lived as free people of color, eventually moving to Ohio, where they gave the interviews that preserved their family's oral history. In the gentle flow of time, consider what life must have been like for Sally Hemings herself, this woman who occupied such a peculiar position in Jefferson's household. She was not his wife, could never be his wife in the eyes of the law or society, and yet she was clearly more than an ordinary enslaved person. She had her own room near Jefferson's chambers, was exempted from field labor, and received special treatment that set her apart from the rest of the enslaved community. But she remained legally his property, subject to his will and his whims, unable to leave even if she wanted to. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The historical debate over the Jefferson-Hemings relationship raged for nearly 2 centuries, with defenders of Jefferson's reputation dismissing the oral history preserved by Sally's descendants as fabrication or confusion. Prominent historians declared the story implausible, arguing that a man of Jefferson's character and principles
would never have engaged in such a relationship. These arguments often revealed more about the historian's assumptions than about the historical evidence, reflecting a reluctance to see a revered founding father as capable of behavior that violated his own stated beliefs. Picture yourself in 1998, when a study published in the journal Nature finally provided the scientific evidence that ended the debate. Researchers collected DNA samples from male-line descendants of Sally Hemings's son, Eston, and compared them with samples from male-line descendants of Thomas Jefferson's uncle. The results were unambiguous. The Y chromosome patterns matched, proving that a Jefferson male had fathered at least one of Sally Hemings's children. Combined with the historical evidence that Thomas Jefferson was present at Monticello during every one of Sally's conceptions, the conclusion was inescapable. Slowly, the scene shifts to consider how this revelation has changed our understanding of Jefferson and the founding era. The Thomas Jefferson Foundation, which operates Monticello, now officially acknowledges the relationship and has created an exhibit dedicated to Sally Hemings's life. Her story is no longer hidden, but is presented as an essential part of understanding who Jefferson was and what life was like on his plantation. The contradiction between his words about human equality and his actions as a slaveholder is now impossible to ignore. Feel the weight of history around you as we consider what the Sally Hemings story tells us about the nature of slavery itself. The institution was not merely an economic arrangement, but a system of total power that allowed enslavers to do whatever they wished with the bodies and lives of those they owned. Jefferson could father children with Sally Hemings because there was no law, no social constraint, no force on earth that could stop him. The relationship, whatever its emotional content, was fundamentally shaped by this absolute imbalance of power. And you can let this moment blur softly as we approach the final chapter of our journey. Sally Hemings lived until 1835, surviving Jefferson by 9 years. After his death, she was not formally freed, but was allowed to leave Monticello with her sons Madison and Eston, living in Charlottesville as a free woman of color for the remainder of her life. She was listed as white in the census, a final irony for a woman whose life had been defined by the racial categories that governed American society. She was buried in an unmarked grave whose location has been lost to history. Let yourself drift back one final time to consider the legacy of the Jefferson-Hemings relationship in our own time. The story has become a touchstone in debates about American history, about the gap between the nation's ideals and its practices, about the ongoing consequences of slavery and racism. Some see it as evidence that the Founding Fathers were fundamentally hypocritical, their fine words about liberty and equality hollow in the face of their personal behavior. Others see it as a more complicated story, one that reveals the humanity of historical figures without necessarily diminishing their achievements. In the gentle flow of time, consider how Sally Hemings would have wanted to be remembered if she had been given the chance to tell her own story. The historical record preserves almost nothing in her own voice. We know her only through the accounts of others, filtered through their assumptions and prejudices. She was intelligent enough to negotiate for the freedom of her children, resourceful enough to navigate the impossible position she occupied, and strong enough to survive 4 decades as the unacknowledged partner of one of history's most famous men. But the details of her inner life, her thoughts and feelings and hopes and fears, are lost to us forever. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away. Monticello still stands on its hilltop, still drawing visitors who want to see where Thomas Jefferson lived and worked and wrote the words that shaped a nation. The tour now includes the room where Sally Hemings slept, the spaces where her children were born, the complicated reality that existed alongside the elegant philosophy. The full story of this place can finally be told, and in telling it, we come closer to understanding both the greatness and the tragedy of America's founding. The stars wheel overhead, as they have for countless generations, indifferent to the struggles and secrets of the people who have lived beneath them. Sally Hemings looked up at these same stars, and perhaps she wondered what future generations would make of her story, if they would ever know or care about the life she had lived. We know now, and we care. And that knowledge changes how we understand everything else about the men who made America. Picture yourself standing one last time on the terrace at Monticello, looking out over the landscape that Jefferson loved so deeply. The mountains rising in the distance, the fields spreading out below. This was the world he created, an elegant combination of European sophistication and American practicality. A monument to his taste and intelligence and vision. But it was also a world built on the labor of hundreds of enslaved people, people whose sweat and suffering made the elegant lifestyle possible, people whose names and stories were rarely considered worth recording. In the gentle flow of time, consider the children that Sally Hemings bore at Monticello. These mixed-race offspring of America's most famous advocate for human equality. Beverly and Harriet, who left in their early 20s and disappeared into white society, choosing to pass as white and leaving their family behind. Madison and Eston, who lived as free people of color, who told their story to anyone who would listen, who insisted that their father was Thomas Jefferson, despite the denials of his white descendants. These children embodied the contradictions of their father's world, caught between races in a society that demanded everyone choose a side. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The oral history preserved by Sally Hemings's descendants was dismissed for nearly 2 centuries by historians who could not or would not believe that Jefferson had maintained such a relationship. They insisted that the story was fabrication, rumor, the invention of enemies seeking to damage Jefferson's reputation. They pointed to Jefferson's own words about the inferiority of black people, arguing that he could never have engaged in an intimate relationship with someone he considered less than fully human. But these arguments revealed more about the historians than about Jefferson, reflecting their own assumptions and prejudices rather than any genuine engagement with the evidence. Feel the weight of history around you as we consider what the DNA evidence revealed in 1998 and what it meant for our understanding of Jefferson. The Y chromosome match between Eston Hemings's descendants and the Jefferson family line was unambiguous. Combined with the historical evidence, the timing of conceptions, the oral histories, the special treatment that Sally and her children received, the conclusion was inescapable. Jefferson had fathered at least one, and probably all, of Sally Hemings's children. The longest-running controversy in American historical scholarship had finally been resolved. Slowly, the scene shifts to consider how Monticello has changed in response to this revelation. The plantation that once presented only Jefferson's perspective now includes exhibits on the lives of the enslaved people who lived and worked there. Sally Hemings has a room dedicated to her story, her existence finally acknowledged, her relationship with Jefferson openly discussed. Visitors can tour the spaces where she lived and worked, can imagine the life she led within these walls, can begin to understand the full complexity of Jefferson's legacy. There will be nothing to solve right now,
only a quiet passing of time. Let yourself drift back to imagine Sally Hemings in her final years, living quietly in Charlottesville with her sons, watching the world change around her. She had seen slavery challenged and defended, had watched her children make their way in a world that did not know what to do with people like them, had kept her secrets for a lifetime. What did she think about the man who had been both her owner and her partner? What memories did she carry of Paris, of Monticello, of the children she had borne and lost? The historical record offers no answers, only silence. In the gentle flow of time, consider the legacy of the Jefferson-Hemings relationship for American society today. The story has become a touchstone in debates about race and history, about the gap between American ideals and American practices, about the ongoing consequences of slavery and its aftermath. Some see it as proof that the Founding Fathers were hypocrites, their fine words about liberty meaningless in the face of their personal behavior. Others see it as a more complicated story, one that reveals the humanity of historical figures without necessarily diminishing their achievements. And you can let this moment blur softly as we approach the final chapter of our journey. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away. Monticello still stands on its hilltop, still drawing visitors who want to see where Thomas Jefferson lived and worked and wrote the words that shaped a nation. The tour now includes the room where Sally Hemings slept, the spaces where her children were born, the complicated reality that existed alongside the elegant philosophy. The full story of this place can finally be told, and in telling it, we come closer to understanding both the greatness and the tragedy of America's founding. The night deepens around Monticello. The same darkness that once concealed so many secrets, now illuminated by our knowledge of what actually happened within these walls. Sally Hemings is buried somewhere in Charlottesville, in a grave that has been lost to history, her final resting place unknown even to her descendants. But her story has finally been told, her existence acknowledged, her place in American history secured. And that knowledge, uncomfortable as it may be, is essential to understanding who we really are and where we really came from. But our journey through the hidden lives of the Founding Fathers is not yet complete, for there is one more story to tell. A story about the limits of liberty and the price of power, about a president who signed laws that contradicted everything the revolution was supposed to mean. The year is 1798, and the young American Republic is facing its first great test. Picture yourself in Philadelphia during that anxious summer, the streets buzzing with rumors of war, the newspapers filled with accusations and counter-accusations that seem to grow more bitter with each passing day. France, America's ally during the Revolution, has become hostile and unpredictable, seizing American ships and demanding bribes from American diplomats. The Federalist President John Adams believes the nation is in mortal danger, threatened not only by foreign enemies, but by traitors within who spread French revolutionary ideas and undermine the government's authority. He is about to sign into law a set of measures that will haunt his reputation for the rest of history. Feel the weight of history around you as we consider the man who occupied the presidency during this crisis. John Adams was a genuine hero of the American Revolution, the man who had nominated George Washington to command the Continental Army, who had argued passionately for independence, who had helped draft the Declaration of Independence and negotiated the peace treaty that ended the war. He was brilliant, principled, and utterly convinced of his own righteousness, qualities that served him well in revolution, but would prove problematic in governing.
And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed.
The crisis with France had been building for years, fed by disputes over trade and territory and ideology. French revolutionaries, who had initially seemed to share American ideals of liberty and equality, had descended into terror and chaos, executing thousands of their own citizens in the name of purifying the Republic. Adams and the Federalists saw in France a cautionary tale, a warning of what could happen if radical ideas were allowed to spread unchecked. The Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, saw the Federalists as monarchists in disguise, eager to suppress dissent and concentrate power in the hands of the elite. Slowly, the scene shifts to the halls of Congress, where the Federalist majority is preparing legislation that will give the government unprecedented power to silence its critics. The Sedition Act, passed in July 1798, makes it a crime to write, print, utter, or publish any false, scandalous, and malicious statements about the government, Congress, or the President. The penalties are severe: fines of up to $2,000 and imprisonment of up to 2 years. The act is designed to expire on March 3, 1801, the last day of Adams's term, ensuring that it cannot be used against the Federalists if they lose the next election. Let yourself drift back to understand why this law was so controversial. We must remember what the First Amendment was supposed to mean. Just 7 years earlier, the Bill of Rights had been ratified, guaranteeing that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. The Federalists argued that the Sedition Act did not violate this guarantee because it only punished false statements, not legitimate criticism. Their opponents argued that any government restriction on political speech was incompatible with Republican liberty. In the gentle flow of time, consider who was actually prosecuted under the Sedition Act and what they had done to deserve punishment. Matthew Lyon, a congressman from Vermont, was convicted and sentenced to 4 months in prison for writing that President Adams had an unbounded thirst for ridiculous pomp, foolish adulation, and selfish avarice. Benjamin Franklin Bache, the grandson of Benjamin Franklin and editor of a Republican newspaper, was arrested for criticizing Adams and died before he could stand trial. James Callender, the same journalist who would later expose Hamilton's affair and Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings, was sentenced to 9 months for calling Adams a repulsive pedant and unprincipled oppressor. And you can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. More than 24 people were prosecuted under the Sedition Act, almost all of them editors or publishers of Republican newspapers. The targets were not random. They were carefully selected to silence the most effective critics of the Adams administration. Federalist judges, appointed by Washington and Adams, presided over the trials and imposed harsh sentences. The message was clear: opposition to the government would be treated as a crime, and those who engaged in it would pay a heavy price. Picture yourself in the courtroom where Matthew Lyon stood trial, this Revolutionary War veteran who had fought for the liberty that the government was now denying him. Lyon conducted his own defense, arguing that the Sedition Act was unconstitutional and that his statements about Adams were true. The Federalist judge was unimpressed, instructing the jury that Lyon's opinions were irrelevant and that his criticism of the president was exactly the kind of seditious speech the law was designed to punish. Lyon was convicted and sent to prison, but his constituents re-elected him while he was still behind bars, a rebuke to Adams that foreshadowed the political disaster to come. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away. John Adams would later describe the Alien and Sedition Acts as war measures, justified by the emergency that France seemed to pose to American security. But the war never came, and the measures remained, staining Adams's legacy with the charge of tyranny. When Jefferson defeated Adams in the election of 1800, he pardoned everyone convicted under the Sedition Act and returned their fines. The law was allowed to expire, and subsequent generations of Americans came to see it as a shameful chapter in the nation's history, a warning of how easily liberty can be sacrificed to fear. Feel the weight of history around you as we consider what the Sedition Act tells us about John Adams and the founding generation. These were men who had risked everything for the principle of liberty, who had declared that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, and yet they were willing to imprison their critics when it suited their political purposes. The contradiction is stark, but it is also human. Adams genuinely believed that his opponents were dangerous radicals who threatened everything the revolution had achieved, and from that belief flowed actions that violated the very principles he claimed to defend. There will be nothing to solve right now, only a quiet passing of time. Let yourself drift back to consider another founding father, whose private life contained secrets that history has been slow to acknowledge. Patrick Henry, the Virginia orator whose cry of "Give me liberty or give me death" became a rallying call for the Revolution, was haunted by a tragedy that he kept hidden from the public for the rest of his life. His first wife, Sarah, had suffered from severe mental illness after the birth of their sixth child, probably what we would now recognize as postpartum depression. Unable or unwilling to send her to the public asylums of the day, Henry kept her confined in the basement of their home. In the gentle flow of time, consider what this must have meant for the Henry family. This terrible secret kept within the walls of their Virginia farmhouse. Sarah Henry was cared for by enslaved people who served as her nurses and guards, prevented from harming herself or others, dressed in a straight dress that restricted her movements. She lived this way for several years, hidden from visitors, her existence known only to the household. When she died in 1775, probably by her own hand, Henry buried her quietly and remarried within 2 years. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The story of Sarah Henry's confinement was not widely known during Patrick Henry's lifetime, and for generations afterward, it was either ignored or glossed over by biographers eager to preserve his heroic image. But it speaks to the harsh realities of mental illness in the 18th century, when those who suffered from disorders of the mind were often treated as burdens to be hidden rather than patients to be healed. The man who demanded liberty for himself and his country could not imagine liberty for a wife whose illness made her dangerous and embarrassing. Picture yourself standing outside that Virginia farmhouse, knowing what lies within the basement walls, hearing perhaps a muffled cry or the rattle of chains. The champion of liberty walks these grounds, practices the speeches that will inspire revolution, and below his feet, his wife lives in darkness and despair. This is the complexity of history, the uncomfortable truth that heroes can also be capable of cruelty, that the same people who articulate our highest ideals can fail to live up to them in their own lives. In the gentle flow of time, consider what Sarah Henry's life must have been like in those final years. Confined to the basement of her own home, cared for by people who were themselves enslaved. Her husband building a political career on the idea of freedom, while she had none. The treatment of mental illness in the 18th century was primitive at best, cruel at worst, and there were few options available to families struggling with a member who had lost their reason.
But the choice to keep Sarah hidden rather than seeking help, to bury her in secret rather than acknowledging how she died, speaks to the shame that surrounded mental illness in that era. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. Patrick Henry went on to become one of the most powerful men in Virginia, serving multiple terms as governor, opposing the Constitution because he feared it would create too powerful a central government, fighting for the Bill of Rights that would protect individual liberties from government overreach. But he never publicly spoke about his first wife or how she died, never acknowledged the tragedy that had unfolded in his own home. The man who demanded liberty or death had denied liberty to the woman who shared his bed, and her death, whatever its cause, was shrouded in silence. Feel the weight of history around you as we consider what the story of Sarah Henry tells us about the Founding Fathers and their era. These were men who lived in a world quite different from our own, a world where mental illness was considered shameful, where women had few legal rights, where the concept of treatment as we understand it did not exist. Patrick Henry's decision to confine his wife, rather than send her to an asylum, may have been motivated by genuine concern for her welfare, or by fear of social embarrassment, or by some combination of both. We cannot know his heart, only his actions. Slowly, the scene shifts to consider what all these stories tell us, taken together, about the Founding Fathers and the nation they created. George Washington may have worn the teeth of enslaved people in his mouth. Benjamin Franklin's basement concealed the raw materials of grave robbery and illegal dissection. Alexander Hamilton's affair nearly destroyed his career and definitely destroyed his marriage. Thomas Jefferson fathered children with a woman he owned. John Adams imprisoned journalists who criticized him. Patrick Henry kept his mentally ill wife locked in a basement. These were not villains, but founders, not monsters, but men, and their flaws were as human as their achievements were extraordinary. There will be nothing to solve right now, only a quiet passing of time. Let yourself drift back to consider the alcohol consumption that was so common among the founding generation, a detail that biographers often mention but rarely dwell upon. The Founding Fathers drank prodigious amounts by modern standards, consuming hard cider for breakfast, beer with lunch, wine with dinner, and whiskey at any hour of the day. Colonial Americans drank roughly 3 times as much as modern Americans, and the men who debated independence and drafted constitutions did so with alcohol running through their veins. This is not to suggest they were impaired, but to acknowledge that their world operated by different norms than our own. In the gentle flow of time, consider the strange death of Gouverneur Morris, one of the lesser-known but genuinely important Founding Fathers who helped draft the Constitution and served as minister to France. Morris suffered from gout and other ailments in his final years, including a urinary blockage that caused him tremendous pain. In desperation, he attempted to clear the blockage himself by inserting a piece of whalebone into his urethra, a procedure that resulted in infection and death in 1816. It was a gruesome end for a man who had helped shape a nation, a reminder of how primitive medicine remained even for the wealthy and powerful. And you can let this moment blur softly as we approach the conclusion of our journey. Feel the weight of history around you as we come to the end of our journey through the hidden lives of America's founders. The night has grown deep, the stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the struggles and secrets of the people who have lived beneath them. We have walked through museums and archives, through plantations and townhouses, through courtrooms and basements,
discovering at every turn that the past is more complicated than the simple stories we learned as children.
Picture yourself standing at the grave of one of these founding fathers. Perhaps Washington at Mount Vernon, or Jefferson at Monticello, or Adams at Quincy, paying your respects to men who shaped a nation. You know things about them now that their contemporaries tried to hide, secrets that were buried for generations, truths that complicate the heroic narratives we were taught in school. But this knowledge does not diminish them. It humanizes them, makes them more real, more relatable, more understandable as people rather than statues. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away. The Founding Fathers were products of their time, shaped by assumptions and practices that we now recognize as unjust. They owned human beings, treated women as property, and believed that only white men of means were truly capable of self-government. Their vision of liberty was limited in ways that subsequent generations have struggled to overcome. And yet they also planted seeds that would eventually grow beyond their own imagining, ideas about human equality and natural rights that would be claimed by abolitionists and suffragettes, by civil rights marchers and marriage equality advocates, by everyone who has ever insisted that America live up to its founding promises. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. Let yourself drift back one final time to consider what we owe these complicated, contradictory, fully human founders. We owe them the truth about who they were, which means acknowledging both their greatness and their darkness. We owe them the recognition that they were not demigods, but men, struggling with the same weaknesses and temptations that afflict us all. And we owe them the determination to do better than they did, to build on their achievements while rejecting their failures, to create a more perfect union that includes everyone they left out. In the gentle flow of time, the secrets of the Founding Fathers have finally come to light. The teeth in Washington's mouth, the bones in Franklin's basement, the letters in Hamilton's desk, the children at Jefferson's plantation, the prisoners in Adams's jails, the wife in Henry's cellar. All these hidden truths are now part of the public record, available to anyone who wants to understand the real history of America's founding. The marble statues have been revealed as flesh and blood, and in that revelation we find not disappointment, but recognition, the acknowledgement that even the greatest among us are capable of the worst among us, and that knowledge of this truth is the beginning of wisdom. Feel the weight of history around you one last time as the first gray light of dawn appears on the horizon. The night is ending, and with it, our journey through the hidden lives of America's founders. We have learned things that complicate the simple stories, things that trouble our understanding of men we were taught to revere. But this is what history is supposed to do. Not to comfort us, but to challenge us. Not to confirm our assumptions, but to question them. Not to provide easy answers, but to pose difficult questions. The story of America is still being written, and each generation adds new chapters to the narrative that began in Philadelphia in 1776. The secrets we have uncovered tonight are part of that story, not separate from it, and understanding them helps us understand ourselves. We are the inheritors of both the ideals and the contradictions of the founding, and how we resolve those contradictions will determine what kind of nation we become. The night is ending now, the first gray light of dawn appearing on the eastern horizon. The Founding Fathers sleep in their graves, their secrets finally known, their humanity finally acknowledged. And we who remain carry their legacy forward,
the good and the bad, together, trying to build the more perfect union they imagined, but could never quite achieve. If you've enjoyed this journey through the hidden lives of America's founders, I hope you'll consider subscribing to this channel and leaving a like to help others discover these stories. There are so many more secrets waiting to be uncovered, so many more chapters of American history that deserve to be told. Until next time, sleep well, dream peacefully, and remember that the past is never as simple as we imagine, and that is what makes it endlessly fascinating to explore.